Okay, so let's start with the vocals. First track here, we got vocal 1. Well, it's just called vocal, but I'll call it vocal 1. First thing I started with was a gate. Fortunately, you don't get this one in the free plugin pack, but if you want to use a gate, you can use a gate. You don't really have to. I kind of trimmed out as much of the noise as I possibly could, but I just felt like it needed just a little something extra there for you know, there was a little bit of room noise or whatever coming in every so often. So I used this fast attack, you know, I guess a medium release, 200 milliseconds, and a pretty low threshold. So anyways, you can figure that out on your own. You can find something. If you don't, like I said, you don't have to use it. I just decided to go with it. Again, I used the Sir Elliott preamplifier. This time I made a couple boosts in the bottom end with the bass and the low mids, about 100 hertz and 240. This time I used a selector of 12. So you know what? Let's solo this, and I'll do a before and after. And this will be without any effects on the vocals, just this one plugin.
Episode of my 15 self divided by my hand divine across my arm. Of course you're right again today.
So you can easily hear how it made the vocals a little bit more fuller, seemed to bring them more forward, and it sort of relieved a little bit of that boxiness in the vocal, but still is a little bit there, so we're going to try to correct that. But at the same time, you know, like I was talking about the room, you can still hear the room. Even though I have the gate, you can still hear the room on the vocal, which in this case wasn't an ideal sound, but the problem was, you know, there's really no way to fix that. So you'd have to redo the recording, or yeah, just live with it, I guess. And that's really what we had to do in this case. Next plugin again, I use another dynamic EQ. You can start to see a theme here. So let me just do a quick sidetrack here. So the reason why I'm using the dynamic EQ is mostly corrective stuff, you know. So when I do use these things in a mix session, I try to use them as seldomly as I possibly can, but in situations like this, you know, sometimes you might need to use them more often, and that's the reason why I'm using them. Like, I would rather just use slight little EQ boosts and cuts and just, you know, highlight certain areas or take away certain areas, but sometimes instead of doing major EQ cuts, cuts, it's better to use something like this. It just sounds a little bit more musical. It moves with the sound as opposed to just being static like an EQ. So in this case, I was cutting out around 1500 hertz and 3500. Again, there was like this raspy, you know, harshness to the vocals. So having these two compressors on these EQ bands, you know, it helped to kind of push that harshness down every time it passed the threshold. I use a pretty low compression ratio, 1.5 to 1. You know, whatever. I experimented with it. I felt that's all I needed. So let's do before and after.
Episode of my 15 self divided by my hand divine across my arm. Of course you're right again.
So you can see it helped to smoothen it out a little bit. Now, some of you probably noticed, you know, slight distortion in the vocal. That was really built into the recording. That I couldn't fix that. That was, you know, just part of it. So up here, I mean, it adds a little bit of character, you know, depending on how you like your sounds, you know, it could, you know, be kind of cool, right? So, but anyways, onto the EQ. I dipped out a little in the mid-range here, try to get rid of that boxiness. I tried boosting some of the high end with the guitar and with the cello and everything. It felt like it needed, you know, just a little bit more in the, you know, the upper mids and the highs. So I decided to boost there, and I also cut out the extreme lows. The Sir Elliott seemed to kind of bring out some of that sub bass again, so just took it out with the EQ. So here it is before and after.
Episode of my 15 self divided by my hand divine across my arm. Of course you're right again.
So you can hear our vocals now starting to get away from that boxy sound and starting to open up a little bit, sound a tad brighter. The only problem is, because we had so many, issues with the sound itself, and we had to kind of do a lot of corrective measures, I ended up settling with a vocal that was a little bit harsher, I guess you could say, than I'd like my vocal to sound. But like I said, in every circumstance, you have to kind of give something up to kind of get something in return. So in this case, I wanted an open sounding vocal. I wanted something a little bit brighter, to come through the mix a little bit better. So I had to settle with something that was a little bit harsher, but I got rid of some of the boxiness. I was able to bring the vocal a little bit more forward in the mix. So sacrifice a little bit, but you also get a little bit in return too. So next I use this color EQ. It looks like a really, really huge boost, but it's actually not. I mean, it's still considered a pretty big boost, but it's nothing. It's not like 8 or 10 dBs like on most equalizers. That would be like 8 or 10 dBs or more. In this case, it's only 3.7 dBs at about 13.4 kilohertz. But yeah, I just felt like it needed more air, and then by giving it more air, again, it does tend to make it a little bit harsher, but I step even further away from that boxy sound that I wanted to try to get away from. So anyways, I'll let you hear it before and after.
Episode of my 15 self-divided by my hand divine across my arm. Of course you're right again. Today will be the last day, I've decided.
So now I put this de-esser on here to try to pull back some of that harshness in the higher end. It was around 7K, I guess, more or less. And yeah, that's really what I did to try to alleviate some of that, that high brittleness that was making it sound a little scratchy. So I'll let you hear it before and after.
Episode of my 15 self-divided by my hand divine across my arm. Of course you're right again.
All right. The last thing, again, I use that compressor, sort of using it like a limiter. So every time the vocal, I'm trying to keep the vocal in this sort of range, but still allow the dynamics to breathe. But once it kind of gets outside of that range, I just want this thing to just pull it back and keep it in check. That's exactly what I used it for.
Episode of my 15 self-divided by my hand divine across my arm. Of course you're right again. Today will be the last day, I've decided.
So yeah, you can see as he gets a little bit more aggressive with his vocal, this just pulls it back and keeps it in check. Alright, so on to vocal 2. So as you can see, they're the same color, but basically what I did was I took this vocal here and these vocals down here, and I moved them down to this track. But what I did was I had all these effects on here first. I knew the problem that I wanted to fix in these particular takes, and for whatever reason, when I was trying to use the automation, it wasn't quite doing what I wanted it to do. So I just decided to save these parts with all the effects on it from this effects bin and just move it down to an empty track. So we'll bring this up here. So it's another dynamic EQ. So what happened was he was doing these woes, and every time he did these woes, there's all this bottom end in this 220 hertz region was just, coming through just way too much. So one way that you could do this is you could take an EQ and then you can automate it down so that every time those low frequencies start to push through or push up, then what you're doing is you're starting to slowly bring that EQ down in that area to kind of compensate for that, resonant frequency, I guess it was in this case. But what I decided to do, instead of, because I tinkered with the automation, it wasn't really working the way I wanted it to, so I just bring this in here. It does the same thing. Wherever you set your threshold, as it pushes past that threshold, it pushes against it. So it does something very similar. No, I'll play it with and without the dynamic EQ. I'll play it without it first, and then I'll play it with it after. All right, let's solo this.
Whoa.
Now let's do it with it.
Whoa.
So you can see that it's a lot brighter in this case. So it sounds kind of thin on its own, but when it's in the mix again, it sounds, you know, a lot better. I'll play the rest of the instrumental with it, and I'll play without the EQ, and then I'll put the EQ on, and then you'll hear the difference. So you can hear the tonality difference in that. So now what I'll do is I'll engage this, and then you'll hear a dramatic difference. Once you put it in the mix, like I said, it makes so much more sense, and you'll hear exactly what I'm talking about. So tone-wise, it just fits a lot nicer. So now again, I added this this compressor here, again as a limiter type of thing. I don't really need to explain what I was doing. It's pretty much the same reason as I used it all the other times. Alright, so for the high vocal, this is when it's the chorus, and this is when he gets a lot more aggressive. He starts to sing, you know, with more intensity, and it tends to bring out this mid-range frequency in his vocal, even more so than in the verses. And it was pretty difficult to, you know, to try to manage that. So just going on a tonality basis, I had to separate these vocals from the original ones because they just sounded so different, and they needed to be treated a lot differently. And, you know, sometimes it makes sense to have a lot of automation going on one track, but in this case, to me, it didn't really make a lot of sense. So let's play it without it first, and you'll hear.
Feeling helpless in a sea of desperation. Showed if it only showed.
Yeah, so you can hear there's a little bit more mid-range in his voice just because he's coming out, he's pushing his voice in that region. So now what I need to do is I need to try to smoothen it out a little bit, but not take away from the performance, because when someone's listening to it, I want to try it as little as I possibly can to make them hear that, you know, anything's being done to the vocal. So again, I use the dynamic EQ. That seems to work really well. Again, it's all concentrated on that mid-range. I used it on the 1500 band, and then the 2000. On the 2000, I use a really high ratio, 9.2 to 1. And with the 1500 or 1600 band, I used a lesser ratio, a lot smaller, 3 to 1. And so yeah, let's see what it sounds without it and then with it.
Feeling helpless in a sea of desperation. Feeling helpless in a sea of desperation.
So I made the vocals, you know, a little bit more cloudy, I guess, like not as clear, but it got rid of that harshness. So I was willing to sacrifice a little bit of that just to make it a little bit more pleasing to the ear. Next, I used another de-esser in that high 8K region. So let's listen to it without it and with it.
Feeling helpless in a sea of desperation. Feeling helpless in a sea of desperation.
Alright, just get rid of some of that S's. Lastly, same thing. Another compressor, sort of like a limiter, with and without.
Feeling helpless in a sea of desperation. Feeling helpless in a sea of desperation.
So in this part, it wasn't really doing much. So another thing I did with this one is I added a parallel compressed channel. The vocal needed it just to kind of push it forward a little bit. It gave it kind of, that mid-range that I took away from it, this was able to kind of bring it back. So instead of using an EQ, I just felt like this worked a little bit better, so I went with it. And this M compressor here, it tends to add a little bit of edge to things. It has a certain bite to it, you know, and it kind of just made sense for bringing that mid-range back. So the attack, I used 5.5 milliseconds, threshold -14, release, a long release 1000 milliseconds, and a ratio of about 6.5 to 1. So let's hear without the parallel compression, then with it.
Feeling helpless in a sea of desperation. Feeling helpless in a sea of desperation.
So let me turn on all the other stuff, and we'll play it without the effects, and then with the effects, and then we'll see what we get. So this is without anything on, and then I'll turn everything else on after.
Feeling helpless in a sea of desperation. If it only. Feeling helpless in a sea of desperation. If it only showed.
So I tried to bring the tonality a little bit closer to the other parts that come in after, from the regular vocal channel. And it's not quite there, but, you know, it's close enough. And again, like I said, there's certain things that you can't really control, so you just have to, you know, use your brain and try to figure things out as best as you can, and then put the pieces together that make a little bit more sense to you. Alright, so the harmonies, I didn't really do too much to. Similar to the lead vocal, I used a gate. I think I used the same settings too, just a different threshold. So I don't really need to talk about that. Secondly, I used a compressor. So my kind of objective with the harmonies was that I didn't want them to be too loud, so they're not really that noticeable in the mix. And I wanted them to be behind the vocals, and I didn't really want them to poke through. So there is quite a bit of dynamics in the harmonies, so I use the compressor just to shave those dynamics off, and then it gives that lead vocal all that dynamic space it needs, and then this just, you know, tucks right behind it. So we'll listen to it without this compressor, and then with it. Let's turn this off.
Today will be the last day you've decided. Today will be the last day you've decided.
So yeah, so that's pretty much it for the harmonies. Alright, so on to the vocal effects. Let's do this. So the vocals, they're pretty much, the way that the effects are set up, it's pretty much the same for all of them. Just a slight difference with the high vocal, and even more of a difference with the harmony. So the two vocals, vocal 1 and vocal 2, which are the main lead vocals, those are all being sent to the room, which is where the guitar is being sent to, but it's being sent at a very, very low level. It was just to add like a little extra texture to it, to the vocal. They're also being sent to a delay and then to a hall. With the high vocal, it's the same thing. It's being sent to the room and the hall. The only difference is there's not being sent to the delay, and the high vocal is also being sent to the parallel compression, the Vox channel, which I've already been over. And lastly, the harmony is being sent to just the hall. Again, at the time, all these things made sense, so I just went with them. So let's hear what the vocal sounds like with just the room. Again, it's very low in the mix. It's not really meant to be heard. Just kind of subliminal texture. It's more to be felt than anything. Next, move on to the delay. I use this Vox and Go tempo delay, and it doesn't really give you a readout, like if you're using a quarter or an eighth note or whatever. So you have to kind of just go by the percentage. So 50%, 100% are in time with the song. Well, I tapped it out, and I got 75, whatever BPM. So that's what the delay is set to, 75 beats per minute, and 50%, 100% are in time with the song. And I actually don't know exactly what notes they are, but they did make sense as far as rhythmically with the song. So I will play that, just the delay, and we'll see what that sounds like. Alright, so on to the hall. I used this ambience plugin. I used the decay time of about 2000 milliseconds, and I used a pre-delay of about 52 milliseconds, and that's in time with the track at 75 BPM. And the only other thing that I changed on this, well, I used the Paddy Guitar Southern preset. The only other thing I changed on that preset was the damping, which I turned all the way down, well, almost all the way down. And it just, got rid of those kind of annoying frequencies. Again, this track had more of like a haunting sort of vibe to it, so I wanted to keep along with that vibe. And by taking out the high frequencies with the damping, I was able to, stay in that zone of that haunting feel. So let's hear what this sounds like. So it's kind of in between a hall and in between a room. It's not quite on either end of the spectrum, but it's somewhere in between. And I just thought, it worked pretty well with this song. So let's turn the vocal on now, and let's listen to how all those effects sound together with the vocal.
Episode of my 15 self divided by my hand divine across my arm. Of course you ride again.
So it's more noticeable now since the vocals are soloed, but once everything comes back in, like the guitar and the cello, becomes less noticeable, more in the background, and it just fills in that space to give the vocal a sense of space, but not dominating where it's overpowering and takes up a lot of information in between the speakers. So let's see what else I added. So to the delay, I also added this compressor. I used a really fast attack, a long release, and I was trying to basically just crush it. So every time the delay got out of hand, the compressor, it acted, and it acted aggressively. I used a 9-to-1 ratio on that one. Equalizer, cutting all the top and the mid-range. I wanted, again, going along with that haunting feel by getting rid of all the top end and some of the mid-range and the delays. It was able to make the delays more dark and mysterious, and it just felt like it worked well. And then I used this limiter. It's chopping off probably 2 dBs maybe, and this is just to kind of get those peaks that the compressor wasn't able to get on its own. And what I can do is I can solo the delay and play it without those effects, and I can bring them in one at a time. Episode of my 15 self-divided by my hand divine across my arm, of course again. Alright, now with the reverb, I added an equalizer, and I also added a compressor as well. So with this equalizer, I actually wanted to keep some of the top end in this one, so I didn't really get rid of the top end, but it had this kind of hollow, boxy, honky, weird sound to it. So I basically cut it out, and I cut it out pretty drastically, a lot, like 12 dBs on the reverb. And this, because the vocal already has a natural sound there, just having too much of it, like with the delay and, you know, other stuff going on, it just adds to this weird, well, I wouldn't say weird, but this, you know, unusual mid-range texture to the song. So that's why I decided to take it out. I said, you know what, leave the vocal, let it sit in that range, and just take this out. It's not really sounding pleasing on the reverb anyways, so might as well just get rid of it. And also I wanted to take out some of the bottom end. It just felt like I had too much low presence. So I was rolling off, you know, I don't know, somewhere around like 100 hertz maybe. And that's it. And the compressor, same thing. I used the fast attack again, slow release. This time about 5-to-1 ratio. And it's the exact same thing as the delay. Every time, you know, every time Evan sings and he gets a little bit more dynamic, that means the delay is getting more dynamic, the reverb's getting more dynamic, and I just want the compressor to, you know, pull it back every time it gets out of hand, just to give a little bit of a smoother appearance or a smoother sound to that reverb. So I'll turn them off and then turn them on.
Episode of my 15 self divided by my hand divine across my arm, of course you're right again.
Alright. So now what I can do is I can play, I'll play the guitar and the cello and the vocal, and I'll turn off the effects, and then I will turn them on. So you can hear what the vocal sounds like without the effects and then with them on.
Episode of my 15 self divided by my hand divine across my arm, of course you're right again. Today will be the last day, I've decided, yeah.
It's not really meant to be heard, it's just meant to be felt. You're not really meant to be able to put your finger on it. You're not meant to be able to spot it. It's just there to just add a little bit of effect and kind of help the vocal a little bit and give it some space.